Hello classes, here we're going to start our second video on the progressive era, and as you can see by the title of the PowerPoint, we're going to focus on progressive legislation, or some of the laws that were passed during the progressive era that really paved the way for where we are today as far as labor is concerned, as far as political corruption is concerned, as far as crime and poverty and so on are concerned, those four overarching ideas of the progressive era. So I'd like to start with actually an event, and then I'll link it back to some legislation, and that'll be the kind of theme that we're going to follow with this PowerPoint. All right, let's start with the Triangle Shirtwaist Company accident, right? So as you can see, this was during the year 1911. This is what happened. Just to limit and prevent theft, all exit doors were locked, not just in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, but really that was the norm for all the companies. Well, guess what happened? A fire was ignited due to somebody just flicking their cigarette away. And what happened was, because all the exit doors were locked, people were stuck upstairs. 146 people died. Right? Huge. If this happened today, there'd be lawsuits everywhere. But back then, we didn't have legislation to safeguard our workers. So after this specific event, it questioned, worker safety and fire standards. So because of this event, emergency exits must always be left unlocked, and actually where to exit in every room, right? You could probably look in our classroom when you come in, you'll see an exit sign, or probably more popularly in movie theaters, exit signs are always lit up, and they're that infamous, red lit exit sign. And this is the reason why this exact event during the progressive era, believe it or not. And so, while it questioned worker safety as well as fire standards, also led to worker compensation laws. So, let's talk about the legislation that was passed because of this event. Bam! Right, in 1913, the United States Congress passed the Department of Labor Act. So the goals, as you can see here, it relates directly with the Triangle Shirtwaist incident, is it protects and promotes the welfare and employment of working people, right? Unlocking those exit doors. Yes, could theft happen? And the whole reason why they locked it was preventive theft. Absolutely. But it questioned worker safety. Also, another side effect of the Labor Act was that it lowered hours worked per day per week. If you remember from the urban game, people worked 6 days a week, except on Sundays, 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. That was the norm. If you couldn't hack it or you couldn't do that, you would simply just be fired, because there'd be so many unemployed people waiting to take a job from you. Let's keep going here. As you can see here, just an old school picture from the progressive era, and almost every single person in this picture are what? Yeah, that's right. That's children. Yeah. And, they range from the ages of 9 to 16. Do you know what these children are not? They're not in school. Yes, that's right. They're working, because there is no such thing as child labor laws until the progressive era. So guess what? You guys are juniors. Most of you are 16. Some of you are 17. The chances of you still being in school during the progressive era are slim to none, especially since many of the people during the progressive era were very poor and needed, any type of paycheck possible. And guess what? Children work 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., right? It's hard to imagine, right, guys? Working 20 hours a week and going to school. Imagine working 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week alongside your father. It's crazy. And again, as you can see here, do you see any girls? No. Majority of boys. So while the boys were allowed to go to school, many of them had to drop out and help their families. So what became of this? Well, child labor laws were eventually passed, and they mandated that children up to the age of 16 had to attend school. This is still true today. It also limited the hours children can work per week. Just so you know, when you're in school, you can't work more than 3 hours during a school day, and you can't exceed more than 40 hours a week. So that should sound familiar to you. And also, what this created, these child labor laws, in 1913, they actually created a children's bureau to actually monitor and uphold these laws, and we still have this bureau today. So now, because of these wonderful reforms, these are you guys playing outside, enjoying life after school, right? Chances are most of you are doing this. You're on the computer, right? You're not really outside. Or, you could be outside on your computer. That's probably the more realistic approach. But you weren't these guys. You weren't working 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week at the age of 10 years old, right? You're still in school. So thank the progressive era, because it says you're welcome back. So now what we're going to do is we're going to switch a little gear here. Now we're going to talk about a different type of legislation being passed. So we're going to talk about, boom, voting power. All right, specifically state reform. There's this guy to the right here with crazy hair and a weird look. His name is Governor Robert LaFollette of Wisconsin. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to increase the direct voice of the average citizen, average Joe citizen, average Jane citizen in government. So he had several ideas. And we're going to touch on these in class, but for right now, write them down. All right, bam, here are all 4 of them. Some of these should sound familiar, some of these maybe not, but we'll discuss them all. So one was a direct primary. And what this was is basically citizens can now vote to select, local leaders, such as mayors and governors. And again, this was in part to limit the political corruption. So if people had a say in who they could vote for, hopefully they would vote for the quote-unquote right people. Then we have an initiative. And what an initiative is, and what most progressive legislation and even legislation today is that people can propose new laws. All they have to do is come up with a certain percentage of signatures and get a petition going, and they can actually present this initiative, if they have the proper amount, to the state government, to the local government to get it done. Third here, we have a referendum. Now, this should sound familiar because the Whippany Park High School fields that just passed, they were a referendum. And what a referendum is that citizens, basically through a petition, can either approve or reject a law. And essentially, since it's at the local level, Whippany Park High School referendum was just that. And then last but not least is something called recall. And I'll kind of tie this in with the presidents in a second. But recall is the ability for citizens to remove public officials who are simply just not doing their job, or perhaps have screwed up or are corrupt. On the presidential level, you would call this impeachment, right? Taking out a leader that just really isn't doing their job or is corrupt in some way. So all 4 of these types of state reform limited, or essentially tried to limit, political corruption. However good they did that is, up for debate, obviously, by today's standards. But that was the goal, and that was all started by Governor LaFollette. Let's keep going. All right, so here we have some federal reform. And I'm going to come back to now Teddy Roosevelt, good old TR. And he had something called the Square Deal. And what the Square Deal was is that he focused on something called the 3 C's. And it's conservation of natural resources, control over corporations, and consumer protection. And you can actually see how each one of these C's kind of ties in with the 4 overarching themes of the progressive era. So let's get into each one and let's talk about them. All right, so the first part of the Square Deal was the conservation of natural resources. So Teddy kind of wanted to go green and preserve our natural resources. So in 1905, he instituted the Forest Service Act, and what this basically was is that it managed the nation's water and resources. That's why we have national parks today, is actually in direct effect to this conservation by Teddy Roosevelt. So the second one, and this ties in with a little bit of what we talked about during the Gilded Age and monopolies, is TR is trying to control corporations. This may be viewed as a little bit of, socialist approach, trying to control national industries, but his main goal was something called trust busting, or AKA breaking up monopolies and prohibiting them. And what he did it through was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in 1890. He upheld that act because beforehand, the presidents were not doing a good job of that. And what he did was, he actively broke up something called holding companies. And what holding companies were, you could almost think of it like a conglomerate where they held a bunch of different companies and essentially could develop it into a monopoly. And 2 monopolies that should look familiar to you are the Standard Oil Company, and the other one that may not is the American Tobacco Company. So TR tried to, bust these corporations up essentially and limit the monopolies that they created, and really try to create, fair working conditions and fair competition among other industries. Continuing with the second part of control over corporations, not really a corporation, but I mentioned it during the Gilded Age, is that the railroads, actually, there were special prices for, certain people. So, average Joe farmer couldn't just put a barrel of corn on there as the same price as somebody who moved, hundreds of barrels of corn. So what he finally did was he finally wanted to regulate the railroads. So he passed, during 1906, something called the Hepburn Act, and that's exactly what it did. It made a flat rate for people to transfer their goods on the railroad. So, something very fair. Again, trying to limit that political corruption. That was the goal of the second C. And now moving on to the third C, and this ties directly in with Upton Sinclair, our good old muckraking friend who wrote The Jungle, is that he created two specific pieces of legislation that we still have today. He created the FDA, their Food and Drug Act, and a Meat Inspection Act. So those little, A grade, F grade, B grade stamps that are put on meat. Well, this was in direct effect to TR's, part of the square deal, consumer protection. And so, as you can see here, the goal was to, ensure that, sanitary conditions were being performed in the meatpacking industry, and also that foods were not being mislabeled or diluted or impure, that they were actually, grade A food. All right, last but not least, let's talk about the constitutional amendments that were ratified during this time period. So the 16th Amendment, we'll start there. That it gave Congress the power to levy an income tax. Basically, we still have this today. The money you make is obviously taxed to a certain extent and given to the government. So that's one. The 17th Amendment, which this kind of falls in with Governor La Follette and his, direct primary idea, is that citizens can now vote for senators and state representatives. Again, in part, this is to limit the political corruption that preceded this time period. And then last but not least, we have the 18th Amendment, which was passed in 1920. And what it made was that it was illegal for Americans to make, sell, or import liquor. And the main purpose of this ties in once again with one of the overarching themes of the Progressive Era, was to protect society and curb poverty and violence, because many progressives thought that alcohol had a direct effect in crime and poverty. All right, well, that was it. I know there was a lot of legislation that was passed in some of the events, so if you didn't grab it all right away, don't worry. We're going to be working with this tomorrow in class and the day after in order for you guys to become more familiar with it. All right, cool. That was it. Hope you enjoyed it. See you in class.